Hello everyone, and welcome to this video tutorial on how to apply the law on loss of control to a criminal law scenario. In this tutorial, we're going to be looking at the Sophie and the bullies mini scenario and pulling out the issues that are relevant to loss of control here after we've had a quick recap of what the law is on loss of control. We're then going to look at the idea structure and how we would use that with loss of control to get a really nice answer to this question. To begin with, let's look at the scenario that we've been given. So the situation is that Sophie has discovered that some bullies at school have been stealing from her son Charlie and beating him up. Sophie was furious and she spent a week sourcing an illegal shotgun. Sophie found the bullies outside of school and shot them dead. Now you're being asked to discuss whether Sophie can plead loss of control to her murder charge. And this is an important point to remind ourselves of at the beginning, that loss of control is only available to a charge of murder. So it's a partial defence, only available to murder, meaning you can't plead it for any other crime, only this. And it reduces what would otherwise be murder to voluntary manslaughter. So what that means is, if in the exam you got this scenario and the question was, advise Sophie, you would have to do a full idea on murder first, because of course she's shot dead these bullies, so that's the crime she might be guilty of, murder. And then you would say, once you've dealt with the murder, however, she may be able to plead the defence of loss of control because of what's happened here with Charlie, and then you would do a full idea on loss of control, which we're going to look at today. But this particular question is just asking you to advise her on loss of control. And if it is specific and tells you to do loss of control, then that's what you need to do. Okay, but if it was just advise, you would have to do both. So let's remind ourselves quickly on what the law is on loss of control before we try and tease out the issues for Sophie. So this is going to be a very quick recap. Remember, there is a video tutorial which goes through all of the law on loss of control. So it might be useful for you to go back and watch that again before you come to this tutorial and try to apply the law on it. But a quick recap here. So loss of control is a defence which comes from Section 54 of the Coroners and Justice Act 2009. And this was the act that created the defence, so it's a relatively new defence, and it replaced the old law on provocation. And if you remember, provocation was an ancient defence that was really problematic because it was based on paradigmatically male ideals, and it was actually the way it was framed made it very difficult for women to plead successfully. So we replaced the law on provocation with loss of control, but a lot of the cases that we look at with loss of control, like Ahluwalia, are old provocation cases, but it's fine for us to use them and talk about them here. So the Coroners and Justice Act lists the 3 requirements that you need to prove in order to be able to plead loss of control successfully. Firstly, we need to show that the defendant suffered a loss of control. Now, it need not be a sudden loss of control. That means that there can be a slight time lapse between the thing that triggered them, set them off, and the killing. Now, that didn't used to be the case in the old law of provocation. There couldn't be a time lapse. There had to be a sudden snap, which meant it was easier for men to plead than women, who often experience a slow burn type reaction. But under loss of control, we don't have to have a sudden snap. There can be a time lapse, but it shouldn't look like a revenge killing. Obviously, the law can't condone revenge killings, so we always look at the cases of Ibrams and Bailey to look at how much of a time lapse is permissible. So in Ibrams, 5 days between the trigger and the killing was too long. That looked like revenge, so the defence failed. Whereas in Bailey, the dad got het up, got a load of weapons, got in his car, drove to the person's house and then killed them. Although there was a time lapse there, he was still acting while he was het up, if you like, in the heat of the moment, and was able to have the defence. So whether it's going to be an acceptable time lapse or not is always going to be a question of facts. and you just need to compare those two cases on that. Second requirement, once you've proved there was a loss of control, is that the loss of control had a qualifying trigger. And these are under section 54(1)(b). Remember, you want to put sections into your answer where possible, because that's going to lift you hopefully into the top mark band. So you've got to show that the loss of control was due to a qualifying trigger. And there are two triggers under the Act. There's a fear trigger, section 55(3), and there's an anger trigger, section 55(4). So the fear trigger is that the person lost control and killed out of fear for their own lives or the life of a loved one, say a child. And we use Ahluwalia here. I mean, this case predates loss of control. But we think that had Ahluwalia come about today, this wife who was terribly abused by her husband for many years and eventually snapped and killed him, we think she'd be able to plead loss of control had that case come today using the fear trigger, because she was fearful for her own safety. The other trigger is an anger trigger. So this is where something has made someone really angry and they've snapped and killed. Now, section 55(4) says that in order to plead the anger trigger, it has to be of an extremely grave character, and it must give the defendant a justifiable sense of being seriously wronged. And Doughty was an old provocation case, and years ago, a crying baby was enough to be a trigger for provocation. That isn't the case now, okay? That wouldn't work now, because a crying baby is not something of an extremely grave character, and it doesn't give you a justifiable sense of being seriously wronged. Zebedee is another case we can use on that, where the defendant killed his dad because his dad soiled himself a few times, and it just wound the defendant up and he killed his dad. Now, in that situation, again, it's not of an extremely grave character, doesn't give you a sense of being seriously wronged. Okay, so fear trigger is easier to plead. Anger trigger, you've got to prove those two things as well. We can't allow it for revenge, as we've already mentioned. And the Act also says that infidelity or cheating can't be a qualifying trigger on its own, but it could be considered with other factors. So if there was cheating and something else very unpleasant, like in Clinton, the victim there was taunting the defendant about his suicidal tendencies and his inability to kill himself. Those comments, in addition to the cheating, were sufficiently grave and supported the defence. And the third requirement is that a reasonable person might have reacted in the same way, and that's illustrated in the case of Camplin, which was an unpleasant case where a teenage boy was raped by a man who then laughed at him, and the defendant killed him by smacking him with a chapati pan. Now, clearly, in that case, there was a loss of control because he hit him with the chapati pan. There was a qualifying trigger. You could argue a bit of fear and anger here, and that's fine. It could be both triggers, but it seems like there might have been anger in Camplin. And when you think he's been raped and laughed at, clearly that situation is an extremely grave character and would give you a justifiable sense of being seriously wronged. And you can imagine a reasonable person in that dire situation might have done a similar thing. So that's just a quick recap on how the defence works. And now we've got that fresh in our mind, we can return to the Sophie situation and see whether we think she meets these three requirements. So let's highlight it as we would in the exam. So Sophie's discovered that some bullies have been stealing from her son and beating him up. I'm going to highlight that because this is potentially our qualifying trigger, isn't it? This is what's caused her to get very upset. So in this situation, you've got to think, what trigger is that? You could argue maybe fear. She's fearful for her son. He's going to continue to be beaten up. Might be anger as well, because she's angry that her son's being treated in that way. And when we read on, Sophie was furious. Yeah. So that word is giving you a clue that she's acting out of anger rather than fear. but you could argue both here. So she's angry and she's spent a week sourcing an illegal shotgun. So I'm going to highlight that as well. Spent a week getting the gun. Now, why is that in there? Why is that relevant? Remember that most things that are in a scenario are there for a reason. The examiner wants you to talk about it. So the fact she's spent a week getting a gun shows that while she's lost control, it's maybe not sudden enough. Does this start to look like revenge, like in the case of Ibrams and Gregory? She's found them outside of the school and she's shot them dead, so they're dead. So that would be murder, which we'd have discussed, and then we're going on to loss of control. Okay, so we've pulled out some key issues there. Let's look at how we apply the law to the scenario using the ideas structure. On this slide, I've got a little note here at the top, do an idea on the murder first. And that just comes back to what I told you at the beginning, that you can only use loss of control if there was a murder. Yeah, it's only a defence to murder. So you've got to be sure there was a murder first. In our situation, we've been told just to advise on loss of control, so that's what we're going to do. But if it was just an advise question and there's a killing and they'd got angry, you'd do the murder first, then you'd apply loss of control. So we use idea, and we're used to this framework now. We identify, define, explain, and apply. So we would identify the defendant, and you'd use their name from the scenario. Sophie may have a defence of loss of control under Section 54 of the Coroners and Justice Act, because the facts show they lost control, and it'd be good to put here when she shot the bullies. Yeah, so you're pointing out to the examiner, when did she lose control? Second thing, we define the 3 requirements for loss of control. So you would list the 3 requirements here: loss of control, qualifying trigger, reasonable man might have done the same. And use your sections, because that's going to hopefully lift you into the top mark band. You then are going to explain those 3 requirements. So you've listed the requirements, you're then going to explain them. So explain loss of control with cases. So you could use Ahluwalia there, you could talk about Bailey and Ibrams. Then you need to explain qualifying trigger. So you'd talk about the anger trigger, the fear trigger, get your cases in there. Again, you can use Ahluwalia, Zebedee, Doughty, get those in there. And then explain reasonable man with your cases. So Camplin is the case that you can use on that. And once you've explained the law, you're going to apply it back to your character. And you can see that I've colour-coded this. And my explanation of the law is like a checklist for the order in which I'm going to apply it. So I explained loss of control, which I've put in red. I'm then going to apply loss of control. I then explain qualifying trigger. I'm then going to apply qualifying trigger, and so on. So, firstly, you identify a new scenario. When did they lose control? So you would say Sophie lost control when she shoots the bullies dead. And you would discuss at that point, you know, there's been a week in between, so this might look like revenge, which will prevent her having the defence. I should point out, if you make the decision that you think it's revenge and she can't have the defence, still go on and apply the other elements anyway, because you're still showing you can apply the law. So if we decided it looks like revenge, so she doesn't meet requirement 1, however, if she'd have met this, she would need a qualifying trigger. So go on and apply it all, even if you think it's not all being met. So talk about when they lost control, talk about the trigger, and then say whether a reasonable man might have done the same, and conclude on whether the defence is going to be successful or not. I'm running out of recording time now on this video, so it'd be really useful for you to pause this slide, because on here I've done a bullet point answer to the Sophie scenario for you to look at, and I've colour-coded my define, explain, apply, so that you can see how you would go about it. You would need to write in full sentences, mine are just bullet points.